The wind in the Arizona territory did not merely blow, it scoured. It was a physical weight, a living thing that picked up the red grit of the desert floor and drove it into the pores of skin and the grain of wood, until everything, living or dead, wore the same dusty coat. It was 1878, and the land was parched, the sky a relentless, pale blue lid clamped tight over a frying pan. Here, distance was not measured in miles, but in water. Between the scattered ranches and the huddled, fearful towns, there stretched vast, silent plains of creosote bush and mesquite, broken only by the jagged, purple teeth of distant mountain ranges. Silas Vance wiped the sweat from his eyes with a forearm that was brown as cured leather. He stood knee-deep in the irrigation ditch he had been fighting to clear for 3 days. The mud was heavy, sucking at his boots, threatening to dry into concrete before he could shovel it out to the bank. His corn, stunted and yellowing, rustled dryly in the hot breeze behind him. It was a poor crop on a poor patch of land, 40 acres of hardpan that no one else had wanted, situated too close to the hills and too far from the safety of the settlement. Silas was 34 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray streaking his dark beard made him look 10 years older. He straightened his back, feeling the familiar pop of vertebrae, and looked toward the horizon. There was nothing out there but heat shimmer and the wheeling shape of a turkey vulture. He lived alone. The silence of the homestead was absolute. It was a silence he had courted, a silence he had built like a fortress, inside the small cabin of rough-hewn logs. There was a bed he slept in alone and a table set for one. There was a time, 4 years ago, when a woman named Clara had filled the space with the scent of lavender water and rising dough. But the frontier fever had taken her in 3 days, burning her up while Silas held her hand and watched the light fade from her eyes. After the funeral, after the neighbors had stopped coming by with covered dishes and pitying looks, Silas had locked a part of himself away in the pine box with her. He told himself he stayed for the land, but that was a lie. The land was cruel. He stayed because he deserved the hardship. He stayed because when the wind howled at night, it sounded like the screaming he remembered from the Tonto Basin, years before he met Clara. He had been a scout then, riding with a cavalry unit out of Fort Verde. He had been young, angry at the world, and convinced that he was bringing civilization to a savage land. He remembered the smell of black powder and burning thatch. He remembered the way the village had looked in the morning light, the bodies of women and children scattered like broken dolls among the wickiups. He had not fired the shots that killed them, but he had led the soldiers there. He had found the trail. The blood was on his hands just as surely as if he had held the saber. Now, he drank cheap whiskey at night to dull the edge of that memory. He sat on his porch, staring at the empty dark, waiting for a judgment that never seemed to come. Only silence and the coyotes yipping in the canyons. It was a Tuesday when he hitched the mule to the wagon for his trip to town. The supplies were running low, and he needed nails and flour. The ride to Dry Creek took 4 hours under the punishing sun. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of a dried-up wash, looking as temporary and fragile as a playing card house. Silas tied the mule at the rail outside the general store and beat the dust from his hat against his leg. The air smelled of horse manure and sawdust. Inside the mercantile, it was dim and cooler, the shelves stocked with tins of peaches, bolts of calico, and boxes of ammunition. He moved quietly, gathering what he needed. He was a man who took up little space and made less noise. But as he carried his sack of flour to the counter, the bell above the door jangled, and 3 men walked in. The air in the room shifted, thickening with tension. At the front was Jebediah Holt, a rancher who owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land closer to the river. Holt was a big man, his belly straining against a linen shirt, his face flushed with heat and righteousness. "I tell you, it is not over," Holt was saying, his voice booming off the tin ceiling. "I lost 2 calves last week. Clean cuts. That was no mountain lion. That was 2-legged predators." The shopkeeper, a timid man with spectacles, nodded nervously. "It has been a quiet summer. Mr. Holt, maybe they have moved south." Holt slammed a fist onto the counter, making a jar of peppermint sticks rattle. They do not move south. They circle back. They are like wolves. You think they are gone, but they are just watching from the ridgeline, waiting for you to turn your back. Silas placed his flour on the counter, keeping his eyes down. He wanted no part of this. He knew the hate that burned in men like Holt. Holt had lost a brother in '69, and that grief had calcified into a hard, blind rage that saw every Apache face as the face of a murderer. Holt turned, noticing Silas for the first time. His eyes narrowed. "Vance, you live out there on the edge. You seen anything?" Silas felt the weight of the room settle on him. He kept his voice flat. "I have seen nothing but jackrabbits." Holt stepped closer, smelling of tobacco and stale sweat. "You are too close to the hills. Vance, if they come down, they will cross your land first. You ought to keep your eyes open. Instead of burying your head in the dirt, I mind my own business," Silas said, counting out coins onto the wood. "That is the problem," Holt spat. "A man minds his own business until he wakes up with his throat cut. We are getting a posse together next week, going to sweep the foothills, flush out any stragglers. You should ride with us. You used to be a scout, didn't you? You know how to track them." The memory of the burning village flared in Silas's mind. The smoke, the screaming. He pushed the coins across the counter. "My tracking days are done," Holt sneered, looking around at the other men for validation. "Look at that, a man who won't defend his own neighbors. Maybe you like them out there. Vance, maybe you prefer their company to ours." Silas picked up his flour sack. He did not look at Holt. He did not look at the shopkeeper. He walked out into the blinding glare of the street, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He hated the town. He hated the fear that hung over it like a foul miasma. But mostly, he hated that he understood Holt's anger, because he knew what the war had been. It was a cycle of blood that never ended. The ride back to the homestead was long. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in bruised shades of purple and orange. By the time Silas unhitched the mule, the first stars were piercing the twilight. He sensed the change in the atmosphere before he saw it. A homesteader developed a sixth sense for his own territory. He knew every stone, every fence post, every shadow. Something was wrong. It was small things at first. The next morning, he went to the coop to gather eggs and found the nests empty. A coyote, he thought, but the wire mesh was intact. 2 days later, he noticed that the wood pile had shifted. 3 logs were missing. He had not burned them. Then came the footprint. He found it near the creek that trickled through the back of his property, the lifeline that kept his corn from turning to dust. It was in the mud near the reeds. It was not a boot print. It was a moccasin print, small and light, barely an indentation in the earth. The toe turned inward slightly. Silas stood over the print for a long time, his hand resting on the grip of the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. The wind whistled through the cottonwoods, sounding like a warning. Holt was right. They were watching. He spent the next 2 nights sitting on his porch with a Winchester rifle across his lap, fighting the urge to sleep. He watched the shadows lengthen and twist. He heard the snap of twigs, but he saw nothing. The ghost remained a ghost. On the 4th day, the heat broke records. The air was so hot it felt solid, difficult to inhale. Silas was working near the barn, repairing a harness. When he felt the thirst hit him, he walked toward the creek, wiping grime from his neck. He came through the brush silently. It was an old habit, the scout's tread, rolling the foot from outside to in, breaking no sticks. She was there. She was on her knees at the water's edge, bent low, drinking with a desperate, animal intensity. She cupped the water to her mouth with dirty hands, splashing it over her face, her neck. Silas froze. His hand went to his gun, instinct taking over. She must have heard the slide of leather or the intake of his breath. She spun around, crouching low, water dripping from her chin. In her right hand, a rusted knife appeared from nowhere, held with a trembling but practiced grip. Silas stopped. He looked at her. She was small, painfully thin. Her cheekbones were sharp ridges under skin that was darkened by sun and ingrained dirt. She wore a dress that might have once been calico, now faded to a gray rag, patched with deerskin and rough twine. Her hair was chopped short, uneven, matted with dust, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide, black, and terrified. They were the eyes of a creature that had been hunted for miles, across deserts and mountains, until there was nowhere left to run. She looked at the gun on his hip, then back at his face. She did not speak. She braced herself, the knife point wavering slightly. She looked ready to die, but she looked like she would make him kill her first. Silas looked at the knife. It was a pitiful thing, barely more than a shard of metal wrapped in leather. He looked at her ribs, visible through the torn fabric of her dress. He remembered Holt's voice. Finish the job. He remembered the burning wiki-ups. Silas slowly moved his hand away from his hip. He held his palms out, open and empty. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was rusty from disuse, cracking in the dry air. She did not move. Her eyes darted to the rifle leaning against the cottonwood tree 10 yards away, then back to him. She made a guttural sound in her throat, a warning. Silas took a half-step back. "You are thirsty," he said. "Drink." He gestured to the water. She did not look at the water. She watched his hands. She was trembling, a fine vibration running through her entire frame. It was not just fear, it was exhaustion. She was starving. Silas moved very slowly. He reached into his pocket. She flinched, the knife slashing the air. But he only pulled out a strip of dried beef jerky he kept for his midday meal. He held it out. "Food," he said. She stared at the meat. Her throat worked. The hunger was a physical force, pulling her forward, warring with the terror that held her back. "Take it," Silas said softly. He tossed the meat gently. It landed on the grass between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She snatched the meat up with her free hand, never taking her eyes off him, and backed away toward the dense brush on the other side of the creek. She moved like a shadow, silent and fluid. "Wait," Silas said. She paused, half hidden by the tamarisk. He pointed to the sky. The sun was a white blaze. "Too hot," he said. "You will die out there." She did not answer. She vanished into the brush. Silas stood by the creek for a long time, listening to the water bubble over the stones. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest. He should ride to town. He should tell the sheriff. He should find Holt. That was the law. That was what a white man did in the territory in 1878. But he didn't. He walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy on the earth. That evening, he left a plate of beans and cornbread on the porch rail. He went inside and bolted the door. But he did not sleep. He sat in his chair, listening. An hour after dark, he heard the faint scrape of the plate. The next day, she was still there. He caught glimpses of her, a shadow in the barn loft, a movement in the cornfield. She was watching him, assessing him. The heat did not break. By noon, the world was bleaching out. Silas worked on the fence line, driving posts with a sledgehammer, the rhythm punishing. When he stopped to drink from his canteen, he saw her sitting in the shade of the barn, watching him. She was no longer hiding. Not fully. She was too weak to hide. He walked over to her. She tensed, but she did not run. She was sitting on a pile of old hay, her legs drawn up. "Come inside," he said. She looked at him, uncomprehending. He pointed to the barn door. "Shade, water." She hesitated, then slowly stood. She followed him into the dim, stifling heat of the barn. It was cooler than the outside, smelling of dry straw and mule leather. He pointed to a stall he didn't use, where he had piled fresh hay. "Sleep," he said. He brought her a bucket of water from the well, cool and sweet. She drank it until he thought she would burst. Then she curled up on the hay, the knife still clutched in her hand, and closed her eyes. Silas went back to his cabin. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty walls. "What are you doing, Vance?" he asked himself aloud. He knew the answer. He was courting disaster. If Holt found out, if the town found out, they would hang him. They would burn his place to the ground. She was the enemy. She was the terror that kept mothers awake at night. But when he looked at her, he didn't see a renegade. He saw a human being who had been ground down to bone and gristle by the same unforgiving world that was grinding him. He waited until nightfall. The desert cooled rapidly, the temperature plummeting as the sun vanished. The wind picked up, whistling through the chinks in the logs. He took a heavy wool blanket from his chest. It was a good blanket, one Clara had woven. He walked out to the barn. It was pitch black inside. "Are you there?" he asked into the darkness. There was a rustle in the hay. "I brought this," he said. "Cold tonight." He draped the blanket over the stall door. He heard her movement, the soft scuffling of straw. A hand reached out, dark against the pale wood, and pulled the blanket down. "Thank you," a voice said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was low, raspy, the English heavily accented, the words shaped with difficulty. Silas felt a jolt go through him. It was just 2 words, but they bridged the gap between man and animal, between hunter and prey. He stood there for a moment longer. He wanted to say something else. He wanted to ask her name. He wanted to ask where her people were, but the silence felt fragile, and he was afraid to break it. He turned and walked back to the cabin. That night, he lay in his bed, staring up at the roof beams. The wind rattled the window pane. Usually, the sound made him feel isolated, the last man on the edge of the world. But tonight, the silence felt different. He was aware of the barn standing 50 yards away in the dark. He was aware of the small, breathing presence inside it. He felt a tightening in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was a mixture of fear and something else, a heavy, aching sense of responsibility. He had told himself it was just for one night. He would give her food, let her rest, and in the morning, she would be gone. She had to be gone. But as he closed his eyes, Silas Vance knew he was lying to himself. He knew that by opening his door, even just a crack, he had let something in that he would not be able to easily push out. He felt the weight of his past, the soldiers, the raids, the dead women, and for the first time in a long time, the scale tipped, just slightly, away from shame and toward something that felt dangerous, reckless, and terrifyingly like redemption. He rolled over, pulling his own quilt tighter against the chill, and listened to the wind, wondering if she was warm enough. The justification for her presence began as a negotiation with the elements. One night turned into 2 because the wind rose up, a howling devil that threw sand against the cabin walls with the force of buckshot. 2 nights turned into 3 because the wolves came down from the high country, their mournful, hungry cries circling the homestead like a tightening noose. And 3 nights stretched into a week because the heat settled over the valley with a weight that felt personal. A crushing anvil of white sun that made travel a death sentence for anyone without a horse and a full canteen. Silas Vance told himself he was merely being practical. A dead woman on his property line would bring the sheriff and questions he did not want to answer. But as he watched the sun bleach the color out of the sky day after day, he knew the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was letting her stay because the silence of the cabin had become unbearable, and the sound of another living, breathing creature nearby was a narcotic he could not bring himself to quit. She did not stay idle. The Apache woman, he did not know her name yet, had a capacity for work that matched his own. She saw what needed doing and she did it, moving with a silent efficiency that unnerved him. When he went to feed the chickens in the gray light of dawn, he found the corn already scattered and the eggs gathered in a basket by the door. When he went to chop wood, he found kindling already stacked, the pieces broken to the perfect length. They worked the land together, separated by 10 feet of polite, wary distance, bound by the common enemy of the desert. The landscape was a hard master. The wind was relentless, grinding the red dust into the creases of their necks and the beds of their fingernails. Their lips cracked and bled. The skin on their hands blistered and turned to callus. One afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the south, a towering wall of brown that swallowed the mountains and then the sun. They were out by the irrigation ditch, fighting to shore up the banks before the wind tore them down. "Inside!" Silas shouted over the roar of the gale. She did not argue. They ran for the barn, the sand stinging their faces like needles. They tumbled through the heavy doors, and Silas slammed the bar down, plunging them into a gloom lit only by the shafts of dusty light cutting through the cracks in the wood. The roof rattled violently, the shingles groaning under the assault. They sat on opposite sides of the threshing floor, catching their breath. The air in the barn was thick and hot, smelling of old hay and the ozone scent of the storm. Silas took a drink from his canteen and offered it to her. She took it, her fingers careful not to touch his. "Water is low," Silas said, his voice loud in the enclosed space. "The well has dropped another foot." She nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "The rain does not come." "No," Silas said. "It does not." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind trying to tear the world apart outside. It was in these moments, trapped by the weather, that the language between them began to take shape. It was a cobbled-together thing, a bridge built of broken stones. She pointed to the mule in the stall. "Daju." Silas frowned. "Daju?" She shook her head, a ghost of a smile touching her mouth. "No, Daju." He tried again, twisting his tongue around the guttural sound. She corrected him, her voice soft but firm, repeating the word until he got the cadence right. When he finally managed it, she looked down, hiding a shy, reluctant amusement that softened the harsh angles of her face. In return, he gave her English words: bucket, rope, cloud. She learned quickly, her eyes watching his mouth shape the sounds, her mind absorbing them with the same intensity she used to watch the horizon. "My name," she said suddenly, later that week. It was evening, the purple light softening the brutal edges of the land. They were by the well, measuring the depth with a weighted string. Silas looked up. "What is it?" "Ilke," she said. "Ilke," he repeated. She nodded. "It means dawn, morning." Silas looked at her. She was standing in the fading light, her patched dress hanging off her thin frame, her face marked by hardship. But her eyes were clear. "My name is Silas." He said, "Silas." She tested the word. "It is a hard sound, like stone." He gave a dry chuckle. "I suppose it is." The sharing of names seemed to unlock something. The next day, as they worked to replace a rotted post in the corral fence, she spoke of her people. She did not look at him when she talked. She focused on the wire she was twisting, her hands strong and scarred. She told him of a camp high in the Dragoon Mountains, hidden in a canyon where the sun only reached for a few hours a day. She spoke of sickness that had swept through the lodges the winter before, a coughing sickness that took the old and the very young. She spoke of the hunger that drove them lower, into the path of the ranchers. "There are not many left," she said, her voice flattening out, becoming a recitation of facts rather than a story. "Many dead. The blue coats, the soldiers. They came 3 winters ago. They burned the winter stores. They took the horses. They took people." Silas froze. He was holding the hammer, ready to drive a staple into the wood. The term blue coats hung in the air between them, sharp as barbed wire. He watched her hands. They had tightened on the fence post, the knuckles white. She was not looking at him. She was looking at a memory, and her eyes were dark with a hatred she was too tired to shout. Silas lowered the hammer. The shame that he carried around like a stone in his gut suddenly felt heavy enough to crush him. He could have stayed silent. He could have let her believe he was just a farmer, a man who had always turned the earth and nothing else. But looking at her, seeing the dignity in her posture despite the rags she wore, he could not lie. "Not about this. I was one of them," he said. The words were quiet, clipped. She stopped twisting the wire. She did not turn her head, but her entire body went rigid, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. "I rode with the cavalry," Silas said, forcing the words out. 5 years ago, before I came here, I was a scout." He stared at the wood grain of the post, unable to meet her gaze. "I thought I was keeping the territory safe." He said, "I told myself that, but then I saw I saw what happened after the fighting stopped. I saw the women, the children. His voice trailed off. He remembered the smoke. He always remembered the smoke. I left, he said. I put down the uniform, but that does not wash it off. The silence that followed was louder than the wind. He waited for her to run. He waited for the knife to appear. He waited for her to spit on him and leave him to his rotting fence and his empty life. Finally, she turned. Her face was unreadable, a mask of copper and shadow. She looked at his hands, then at his face. She searched him for a long time, looking for the soldier he had been. "You are here now," she said simply. She turned back to the fence and picked up the wire cutters. The subject was closed, but the air between them had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the tension of strangers. It was the tension of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the same abyss. The outside world, however, refused to stay at bay. 2 days later, the threat that hung over the valley materialized in a cloud of dust on the road. Silas saw them coming from a mile away. 3 riders, moving fast. He was chopping wood, and Ilkay was in the garden, weeding the rows of struggling beans. "Get in the barn," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Hide in the loft. Do not make a sound." She did not hesitate. She dropped her hoe and vanished into the darkness of the barn. Silas wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and waited. The riders slowed as they approached the gate. It was not Holt this time, but 3 of his hands, hard men with dusty coats and rifles in scabbards. The leader was a man named Rourke, who had a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. "Morning." "Vance," Rourke called out, leaning on his saddle horn. Silas walked to the gate, keeping his hands visible. "Rourke, what brings you out this far? Looking for strays?" Rourke said, his eyes scanning the yard. "And looking for vermin?" "Holt says there is sign of Apache moving through the wash to the east." Silas kept his face impassive. "I haven't been to the east wash." Rourke nudged his horse closer. The animal snorted, smelling the water in the trough. "We found a camp about 10 miles back. Cold ashes. Tracks heading this way. You sure you haven't seen anything? No shadows moving where they shouldn't?" Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. He knew Rourke was looking at the garden, at the 2 hoes lying in the dirt. He was looking at the fresh laundry hanging on the line. Was there anything there that looked too small? Too feminine? "I told Holt in town," Silas said, his voice steady. "I see jackrabbits. I see coyotes. I mind my own business." Rourke spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Silas's boot. "It is a dangerous time to be minding your own business. Vance, if you are hiding anything, or if you are too soft to do what needs doing, the town won't look kindly on it." "I am hiding nothing." Silas lied. The words tasted like ash, but he said them firmly. Rourke stared at him for a long moment, the suspicion plain in his eyes. Then he pulled his horse's head around. "Keep your eyes peeled. Vance, we'll be back this way in a few days." Silas watched them ride off, waiting until they were nothing but specks in the shimmering heat before he let his breath out. His knees felt weak. He had lied to his own kind to protect her. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He walked to the barn. "Come out," he said. "They are gone." Ilkay climbed down from the loft. She looked at him, her eyes wide. She had heard him lie. "Why?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "I don't know, but he did know. He just didn't know how to say it." That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The barrier of caution had eroded, replaced by a raw, vibrating awareness. They sat at the small table, eating a stew made from the last of the salted pork and the beans she had saved from the garden. The lantern cast a warm, yellow light over the rough wood. Silas reached for the pitcher of water at the same moment she did. Their hands brushed. The contact was electric. His skin against hers, rough against rough, warm against warm. Silas pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, and she jerked hers away, clutching it to her chest. They looked at each other, then quickly looked away. But the air in the room had changed. It was charged. heavy with things unsaid. Silas could hear her breathing, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to fill the corners of the room. He could smell the scent of her, dust, sage, and something uniquely hers, like rain on dry earth. They finished the meal in silence, but it was not the empty silence of before. It was a silence that waited. She was the one who broke it. She pushed her plate away and looked at the lantern flame. I have a story," she said quietly. Silas looked at her. "Tell me." She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood table. "Years ago," she said, her English halting but determined, "before the soldiers came to my village, I was near the mission. The place where the men in black robes live. I was hiding, watching." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I saw a man and a woman, white people. They were standing by a wagon. The man, he did not grab her. He did not pull her. He put his hands on her face. Like this." She raised her own hands, cupping the air. "Gentle," she said, "soft." And the woman. She did not pull away. She leaned into him. She closed her eyes. It was not taking, it was giving. Silas watched her, mesmerized by the intensity in her voice. She paused, looking down at her hands again. I saw warmth in his eyes. Not hunger, not anger, just warmth. She looked at Silas then, and the naked longing in her expression hit him like a physical blow. "I saw it once," she whispered, "and now I want that." Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at this woman who had seen her world burn, who had been hunted like an animal, and he saw a capacity for hope that shamed him. He had convinced himself that the world was only pain and survival. She knew the pain better than he did, yet she still wanted the softness. He wanted to reach out to her, but he didn't know how. He felt clumsy, rough, unworthy. Ilkay stood up slowly. The mood in the room shifted from storytelling to something sharper, more dangerous. She looked at him with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. She reached for the top button of her dress. Silas stopped breathing. "What are you doing?" he rasped. She did not answer. She undid the button, then the next. She loosened the fabric and let it slide down her left shoulder, exposing the skin to the lantern light. Silas flinched. Her shoulder was a map of violence. There were old, silvered lines where a whip had cut the skin. There was a puckered, ugly scar near her collarbone that looked like a bullet wound that had healed badly. The skin was marked, ruined. She stood there, trembling, the dress gathered at her chest, her shoulder bare. "Do you see?" she asked, her voice shaking. "This is what men have done. This is what I am. Marks, pain." She stepped closer to him. The heat of her body radiated across the small space. "Can you see? Can you see me? Or only this? Can you ever look at me like that man looked at the woman, with tenderness?" Silas stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He looked at the scars, and a wave of fury rose in him, not at her, but at the men who had done this. And beneath the fury, a surging tide of tenderness that terrified him. He moved around the table. She flinched, bracing herself, but he did not reach for her skin. He reached for the heavy wool coat hanging on the peg by the door. He stepped in front of her. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. He could see the tears standing in her eyes. He gently draped the coat over her shoulders, covering the scars, covering the pain. He pulled the lapels together, his knuckles grazing her chin. He kept his hands there, holding the coat closed, creating a shelter for her. "I see you." "Ilkay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see you." He looked deep into her eyes, willing her to believe him. "And I swear to you," he whispered, "I will never take anything from you. I will never add a mark to you. Never." She let out a sob, a broken sound that seemed to tear itself out of her chest. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against his chest, the rough wool of his coat scratching her cheek. Silas hesitated for a second, then wrapped his arms around her. Over the coat, he held her tight, feeling the tremors running through her body. He held her as the wind howled outside, trying to get in. They stood like that for a long time. the barrier of the coat between them, yet closer than they had ever been. That night, Silas did not send her back to the barn. It was not spoken, but it was understood. The barn was cold, and the distance was too great. He took the extra quilt and made a pallet on the floor near the hearth. He gave her his bed. "Sleep," he said, blowing out the lantern. "You are safe here." The room plunged into darkness. Silas lay on the hard floor, listening to the settling of the logs. He could hear the rustle of the mattress as she settled in. He was hyper-aware of her presence, of the woman lying a few feet away in the dark. He was restless. Every nerve in his body was singing. He felt a profound sense of protectiveness, but also a deep, aching loneliness that was suddenly more acute because the remedy was so close. Across the room, Ilkay lay awake as well. She pulled Silas's pillow close, smelling the scent of him, tobacco and pine soap. She touched her shoulder where the coat had rested. She had terrified herself by showing him the scars, by asking for the impossible, but he had not turned away. He had covered her, in the dark of the Arizona night, with the wind scouring the walls. Two lonely people lay awake under the same roof, separated by a few feet of wooden floorboards and a lifetime of scars, both wondering if the fragile bridge they were building would be strong enough to hold them when the storm truly broke. The flour sack was light. When Silas lifted it from the pantry's shelf, the lack of weight traveled up his arm like a dull ache. He set it on the table and folded the top down. There was enough for maybe 3 days of biscuits, if they were careful. The salted pork was gone. The coffee was a memory. Nothing but dregs in the bottom of a tin. Silas looked out the window. Ilkay was by the woodpile, her back to him. She was stripping bark from a cedar branch, her hands moving with a repetitive, hypnotic rhythm. She had been with him for 2 weeks now. The town had not come for him yet, but the silence from Dry Creek was louder than any shouting. He knew they were talking. He knew Holt was stirring the pot, letting the fear simmer until it boiled over into violence. He walked out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain that never fell, just hung in the sky as bruise-colored clouds that taunted the parched earth. "We are running low," Silas said. Ilkay stopped her work. She turned, wiping a strand of black hair from her forehead. She looked at the house, then at the empty horizon. "I know," she said. She dropped the branch and walked toward him. She moved differently now. The skittishness of the hunted animal was gone, replaced by a wary determination. She stopped at the foot of the steps. "I must go," she said. Silas felt a sharp pang in his chest, surprising in its intensity. He crossed his arms, leaning against the rough-hewn post. "Go where? Back to the hills? You will starve before you get halfway up the Dragoon." "I did not come just for me," Ilkay said. Her voice was low, laced with a guilt she had been carrying since the moment she drank his water. "I came to steal." Silas watched her. He had known. Of course, no one survived in this territory on accident. "I know," he said. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You do not know. It is not just hunger. It is sickness. My people, the ones who are left, they are in a canyon 2 days' ride from here. The children are coughing blood. The old ones cannot walk. We have no powder for the rifles. We have no medicine." She looked down at her hands, which were cleaner now, but still scarred. "I was sent to find a ranch," she continued, "to find a place where the white men were careless. I was supposed to take food, take mules, and go back." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and wet. "But you saw me," she said. "You gave me water. You covered me with your coat. And now I have stayed too long. I am warm while they are shivering. I am eating while they are chewing on bark." The guilt in her voice was a physical thing. It mirrored the guilt Silas lived with every day. He understood the weight of survival when others had fallen. He looked at the mule grazing in the paddock. He looked at the sacks of seed corn he had been saving for next spring. It was his future. It was the only thing that kept him from being a drifter. "If you go back alone," Silas said slowly, "you will be caught. Holt has riders patrolling the wash. They will see a lone woman with a pack and they will shoot first. I have to try, she said. Silas pushed off the post. He walked down the steps and stood in front of her. He was a practical man. He knew the odds. Helping her here, on his land, was dangerous. Helping her out there, bringing aid to a renegade band, was treason. It was a hanging offense. But he looked at her face, and he remembered the feel of her trembling against him when he held her coat shut. He remembered the silence of the cabin before she came, a silence that tasted like dust and whiskey. "We will take the wagon as far as the rock slide," he said. "Then we will pack the mule." Ilkay stared at him. You will come." Silas nodded. "I have sacks of corn. I have some quinine left from the fever year, and I have ammunition." He saw the shock register in her eyes. "You cannot," she whispered. "If the soldiers catch you helping us, they will hang me." Silas finished. "I know." "Why?" she asked. "Why do you do this?" Silas looked past her, toward the jagged line of the mountains. "Because I am tired of the killing," he said, "and because I do not want to go back to an empty house." They left an hour before sunset. It was a risk, moving while there was still light. But they needed to cover the open ground before the moon rose. They loaded the mule with everything Silas could spare: bags of cornmeal, dried beans, a small keg of molasses, blankets, and 2 boxes of Winchester cartridges. The journey was a descent into a harsh, prehistoric world. The land rose up to meet them, twisting into shapes that defied logic. They moved through dry riverbeds where the stones were white as bone, and up steep, crumbling trails where the mesquite tore at their clothes with thorny fingers. Silas led the mule, his rifle in his hand. Ilkay walked beside him, her eyes scanning the ridgelines. They did not speak much. The terrain demanded their breath. By the second night, they were high in the foothills. The heat of the day vanished the moment the sun dropped, replaced by a biting cold that seeped through their coats. The air was thin and sharp. They made camp in a shallow depression beneath a shelf of granite. It was too dangerous to light a fire. The smell of smoke would carry for miles. They ate cold beans and hardtack, sitting shoulder to shoulder against the rock wall. The sky above them was a crushed velvet canopy of stars, so thick and bright they seemed to press down on the earth. "It is cold," Silas said. Seeing her shiver, Ilkay pulled her blanket tighter. "It is the wind. It cuts." Silas hesitated. Then he opened his own heavy wool coat. "Come here." She looked at him, her face pale in the starlight. She did not argue. She shifted closer, and he wrapped the coat and his blanket around both of them. They sat huddled together, sharing the only heat they had, the heat of their own blood. It was awkward at first. Silas held his body stiff, careful not to press too hard, but as the cold deepened, biology overrode propriety. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He relaxed his arm, letting it rest around her waist to keep the blanket in place. He could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He could smell the sage in her hair. It was an intimacy born of survival, but it stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. It was not just desire, though that was there, a low hum in his blood. It was a sense of rightness, of fitting. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the wind picked up, moaning through the crevices of the rocks like a dying animal. Silas was dozing when he felt her jerk violently. Ilkay cried out, a sharp, ragged sound. She thrashed against him, her hands clawing at the blanket. "No, no fire! The babies!" She was trapped in a nightmare, lost in the smoke of a memory. Silas tightened his grip. Ilkay, wake up!" She did not hear him. She was fighting an invisible enemy. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice cracking. Silas turned, pulling her fully into his arms. He pressed her face against his chest, muffling her cries. He rocked her, holding her tight enough to ground her. "You are here," he whispered into her hair. "You are safe. I have you. It is just the wind." She gasped, her body rigid, her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, the reality of the cold night and the solid warmth of his chest broke through the terror. She went limp, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. Silas kept whispering, a stream of nonsense words, soft and steady. Easy now. I am here. I am not going anywhere. She lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear. She looked at his face, illuminated by the starlight. I saw them, she whispered. The blue coats. They were burning the wickiups. I know, Silas said softly. I know. She looked at his mouth, then she looked at his eyes. The fear in her gaze began to shift, replaced by a desperate need for connection, for something alive and real to chase away the ghosts. She leaned in, just an inch. Silas felt the pull. It was magnetic. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to bury his face in her neck and forget the world. But he felt the tremor in her hands, the fragility of her in that moment. To touch her now, while she was raw from the nightmare, felt like taking advantage of her fear. He gently placed his hand on the back of her head and guided it back to his shoulder. Rest, he said, his voice rough. I will watch. She stayed there, pressed against him, and he felt the tension slowly leave her body. But the air between them remained charged, vibrating with the ghost of the kiss that hadn't happened. They reached the camp late the next afternoon. It was not a camp so much as a place where people were waiting to die, hidden in a box canyon, sheltered by towering walls of red rock. A dozen makeshift shelters clung to the earth. They were built of brush and scavenged canvas. As Silas and Ilkay led the mule into the clearing, silence fell. It was a heavy, hostile silence. Figures emerged from the shadows. They were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over bone. Children with swollen bellies and large, listless eyes watched from the safety of their mothers' skirts. Men, too weak to stand straight but still holding rifles, stepped forward. Silas felt the weight of their stares. He was the enemy. He was the face of the people who had done this to them. Ilkay stepped forward, raising her hands. It is me, she called out in Apache. I have returned. A man stepped out from the largest shelter. He was old, his hair white and stringy, his face a map of deep canyons. But his eyes were hard. This was Nanstan, the elder who held the fragment of the band together. He looked at Ilkay. Then he looked at Silas. He spat on the ground. You bring a white man here? Nanstan said, his voice raspy. You bring the wolf to the sheep, I bring food, Ilkay said, her voice shaking but defiant. I bring medicine. He helped me. Nanstan walked up to Silas. He smelled of sickness and old smoke. He peered into Silas's face. I know you, the old man said in broken English. I have seen you. You rode with the soldiers. At Verde. Silas did not flinch. He did not reach for his gun. He stood with his hands open at his sides. I did, Silas said. A murmur of anger went through the small crowd. A younger man, his arm in a dirty sling, stepped forward, his hand on a knife. Killer, the young man hissed. Silas looked at Nanstan. I was a soldier. He said, I cannot change that. But today I'm just a man with a mule. I brought corn. I brought quinine. Why? Nanstan asked. Why does the soldier bring corn? Because she asked me to, Silas said, nodding at Ilkay. And because people are hungry. Ilkay stepped between them. She looked at her people. Look at him, she cried. He could have killed me. He gave me water. He risked his life to come here. If the soldiers find him with us, they will kill him too. He is not the enemy today. Nanstan looked at the mule, laden with sacks. He looked at the starving children. The pride in his eyes warred with the necessity of survival. Finally, survival won. Unload the beast, Nanstan muttered. Then he leaves. They spent the next hour distributing the supplies. Silas worked silently, handing out the sacks. He saw the way the women looked at the cornmeal, weeping softly. He saw the way the men checked the ammunition boxes, their faces grim. He felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting a graveyard he had helped fill. But every time he caught Ilkay's eye, she gave him a small, terrified nod of gratitude. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, when the crack of a rifle shot shattered the air. Dirt kicked up near Silas's boot. Get down, Silas roared. Chaos erupted. From the ridge above the canyon entrance, muzzle flashes bloomed like angry flowers. It was not a disciplined volley. It was the ragged fire of a posse. "They found us!" someone screamed. Silas grabbed his Winchester from the saddle scabbard. He threw himself behind a fallen log, dragging Ilkay with him. "Who is it?" she shouted, pressing her face into the dirt. "Trackers," Silas yelled back, working the lever of his rifle. "Hired guns. Probably Holt's men." Bullets chewed up the ground around the wickiups. The Apache warriors, despite their weakness, returned fire, their ancient rifles booming. Silas saw a movement on the ridge. A man in a duster coat was taking aim at a group of women trying to flee toward the back of the canyon. Silas didn't think. He didn't weigh the politics. He didn't consider his race. He simply saw a threat to the people he was eating with. He raised his Winchester, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The man on the ridge threw his arms up and fell backward. Silas chambered another round. He was shooting at white men. He was shooting at men he might have shared a drink with in the saloon. The realization should have frozen him, but it didn't. It liberated him. He had chosen his side. "Watch the left flank," Silas shouted to the young warrior with the sling. "They are trying to circle!" The firefight was intense but short. The attackers, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and were facing return fire from a marksman, began to pull back. "They are running," Ilkay yelled. Silas stood up to get a better shot at a retreating figure. "Silas, down!" Ilkay screamed. He heard the sound, a wet thud, like a fist hitting a side of beef. Then the pain bloomed, white-hot and sickening. In his left side, the world tilted. The red rock spun. Silas dropped to one knee, clutching his ribs. Warm blood seeped through his fingers, dark and slick. He tried to stand, to prove he was still in the fight, but his legs turned to water. He fell forward, the grit of the canyon floor scraping his cheek. The last thing he saw was Ilkay's face, terrified and fierce, filling his vision as the darkness rushed in. He woke to the smell of burning sage and the low murmur of voices. He was lying on a pile of furs in a small wickiup. The air was smoky. He tried to move, and a lance of pain shot through his side, stealing his breath. "Lie still." Ilkay was there. She was kneeling beside him, a bowl of water in her hand. Her face was streaked with soot and dried tears. Did they go?" Silas rasped. "They are gone," she said. "You hit 2 of them. They will not come back tonight." She set the bowl down and dipped a cloth into it. "I need to clean it. The bullet went through. It is a clean hole, but you lost blood." She peeled back the blood-soaked shirt. Silas gritted his teeth as the cool water touched the raw flesh. He watched her hands. They were steady now, efficient. She was a healer as much as she was a survivor. She worked in silence for a few minutes, binding the wound with strips of clean cloth she must have torn from her own petticoat. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, looking at him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "You fought for us," she said softly. "You shot your own people." Silas looked at the roof of the shelter. "They were not my people," he whispered. "Not anymore." Ilkay leaned closer. The firelight danced on her skin, turning it to bronze. The fear of the attack was fading, replaced by the adrenaline of survival and something else, something that had been building since the night in the barn. She reached out, but she did not touch his wound. She moved her hand higher, to his chest, over his heart. Her palm was warm against his skin. She pressed lightly, feeling the steady thud, thud, thud of his life. She lowered her dress slightly at the shoulder, just enough to show the smooth, unblemished skin above her heart, mirroring his position. "You said you would never mark me," she said, her voice trembling. "You kept your word, but today you let them mark you for me." She took his hand, his large, calloused, blood-stained hand, and pressed it against her chest. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart under his palm, the soft swell of her breast. "I want the warmth." "Silas," she whispered, using his name like a prayer. "I do not want to wait anymore. The world is burning. We might die tomorrow." Silas looked at her. He saw the scars she carried on her soul, and he saw the love she was offering him. A love that was impossible, dangerous, and the only true thing he had ever found. "I was afraid," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I was afraid I would break you. I was afraid I was too rough." "You cannot break me," Ilkay said, fierce and low. "I am already broken. We build from the pieces." She leaned down. This time, there was no hesitation. This time, there was no pulling back. She pressed her mouth to his. It was not a smooth kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had forgotten how to be gentle. It tasted of salt and smoke and desperation. Silas's hand tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, careful of his wound but needing the contact. Her hands framed his face, her thumbs tracing the rough stubble of his jaw. They kissed as if they were trying to breathe life into each other. It was slow and deep, acclaiming, in the smoky darkness of the wickiup, surrounded by enemies and death. Silas Vance finally let go of the soldier he had been and the lonely man he had become. He kissed the woman who had saved him, and for the first time in his life, the silence in his head was filled with a song. The separation at the canyon mouth was a tearing of flesh. The band, led by Nanstan, moved deeper into the jagged spine of the Dragoon Mountains, retreating toward the high passes where the air was thin enough to starve a fire. They were ghosts fading into stone, leaving nothing behind but the echo of a hoofbeat. Silas Vance and Ilkay turned west, back toward the valley, back toward the homestead that felt less like a home and more like a trap waiting to be sprung. The journey back was a punishment. The bullet hole in Silas's side, though stitched and bound, burned with a dull, throbbing heat that synchronized with the rhythm of the mule's gait. Every step was a jar that sent white sparks dancing across his vision. He rode the mule because he had to. Walking had become impossible after the first 3 miles. Ilkay walked beside him, her hand resting on his knee, her eyes scanning the scrub brush with the intensity of a hawk. They were 10 miles from the homestead when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The heat, which had been pressing down on them for weeks, suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, wet wind that smelled of ozone and wet sage. "Storm," Silas grunted. Looking up, "It is moving fast," Ilkay said. She pointed to the north, where a curtain of gray rain was erasing the mountains. They pushed the mule, but the desert had a way of turning treacherous in an instant. The rain hit them not as drops, but as sheets, a solid wall of water that hammered the earth with violence. Within minutes, the dry washes they had crossed an hour ago were roaring torrents of brown sludge, carrying trees and boulders down from the high country. "We have to get high," Silas shouted over the roar. They scrambled up a shale slope, the mud sucking at Ilkay's moccasins. The mule balked, terrified by the thunder that cracked like artillery fire directly overhead. Silas slid from the saddle, his boots skidding on the wet rock, pain tearing through his side. He grabbed the bridle, hauling the animal up the incline. "There!" Ilkay yelled. She pointed to a shallow undercut in the limestone cliff face, a cave, barely deep enough to keep a man dry. They shoved the mule into the brush near the entrance and huddled into the recess of the stone. The temperature plummeted. The rain lashed the land, turning the world into a gray blur. Silas leaned back against the cold rock, his teeth chattering. The fever from the wound, kept at bay by quinine and will, was rising to meet the chill of the storm. Ilkay moved to him instantly. She stripped the wet coat from his shoulders and pressed her body against his. There was no fire, no wood dry enough to burn. There was only the heat of their skin. "Stay with me, Silas," she commanded, her voice fierce in his ear. "I am here," he murmured, his eyes heavy, just cold. She held him through the night while the flash floods carved new scars into the valley floor below. She rubbed his arms, his chest, whispering stories of the sun, stories of the desert when it blooms. She was the anchor keeping him from drifting away into the dark water of the fever. When the sun rose, the world was altered. The violence of the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. They made the final trek to the homestead in a daze of exhaustion. The farm was a ruin. The flash flood had jumped the banks of the creek, the cornfield, which Silas had fought so hard to keep alive. was a flattened mat of mud and broken stalks. The irrigation ditch was gone, washed out completely. The garden Ilkay had tended was a wreckage of silt. Silas stood on the porch, leaning heavily on a crutch he had fashioned from a mesquite branch. He looked at the destruction. Months of labor, years of sweating into the soil, gone in a single night. "It is gone," he said, his voice flat. Ilkay stood beside him. She did not look at the field. She looked at him. "The land recovers," she said. "Not this year," Silas replied. "There is a frost coming. I can feel it." He was right. 2 nights later, a late, unnatural frost settled over the valley, the final insult of a chaotic season. It killed the few bean plants that had survived the flood. The homestead was dead. It was no longer a farm. It was just a piece of ground with a house on it. But the death of the crops meant something else. It meant they had nothing to lose. Silas turned the barn into a warehouse. They had brought back what they could not carry to the mountains. And now the plan was simple and dangerous. He would sell everything he had. The plow, the extra harness, the furniture if need be, to buy powder and lead. He would turn his inheritance of soil into survival for her people. But the town of Dry Creek was not asleep. The storm had kept people indoors, but tongues had not stopped wagging. Silas rode into town 3 days after the flood. He left Ilkay hidden in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor. A trapdoor covered by a rug and a heavy table. "Stay," he had told her. "Do not come out, not even if you smell smoke." The town felt different. The hostility that had been a low hum was now a vibration in the air. As Silas tied the mule to the rail in front of the mercantile, he felt eyes on him. He walked into the store. The bell jingled, a cheerful sound that died instantly in the heavy silence of the room. 3 men were standing by the stove. One of them was Rourke, the ranch hand who had questioned him. The other 2 were drifters, hard men with eyes like flint. Silas walked to the counter. The shopkeeper, a man named Miller, would not meet his eyes. "I need 4 sacks of flour," Silas said, "and 3 kegs of black powder." Miller wiped the counter with a rag, staring at the wood. "That is a lot of powder. Vance, you planning on blowing up a mountain?" "Just clearing stumps." Silas lied. The lie was thin, worn through. One of the drifters laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "Stumps. Is that what we are calling them now?" Silas stiffened but did not turn. "I will take the beans too, Miller. And the coffee. All of it." Rourke stepped away from the stove. His boots were heavy on the floorboards. "You got a big appetite for a man living alone." "Vance," Rourke said. "Or maybe you aren't alone." Silas turned slowly. His hand hovered near his hip, not touching the gun, but close. "I pay for what I take. Rourke, that is all that matters." Rourke spat a stream of tobacco juice. It landed an inch from Silas's boot. "It matters who you are feeding," Rourke said. "We found tracks. Vance, near the wash. Small tracks, moccasin tracks. And we heard talk. A hunter saw a woman riding with you. A red woman." Silas held Rourke's gaze. He did not blink. The fear was there, pounding in his chest, but the anger was stronger. "I don't know what a hunter saw," Silas said. "But if you come onto my land again without a warrant, Rourke, I will treat you like a trespasser." Rourke stepped closer. "You are a savage lover. Vance, that is what you are. A traitor to your own blood. You think we don't know? You think we are going to let you harbor them while they butcher our cattle?" Silas felt the room tilt. The slur hung in the air, violent and absolute. He wanted to hit Rourke. He wanted to break the man's jaw, but he knew that if he threw a punch, the town would descend on him. He would end up in a cell or swinging from a cottonwood. And Ilkay would be alone in the cellar. He forced his jaw to unclench. He turned back to Miller. "Put it on my tab," Silas said. Miller shook his head. "Cash, Vance. No credit. Not for you. Not anymore." Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small leather bag that held his life savings. Money from the last good harvest. Money he had been saving for a new plow. He emptied it onto the counter. "Take it," Silas said. He hauled the sacks out to the wagon himself, ignoring the stares, ignoring the whispers that followed him like angry hornets. He knew, with a cold certainty, that he would never walk into this store again. When he got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. He parked the wagon in the barn and bolted the doors. He went into the house, moved the table, and opened the trap door. Ilkay climbed out. She looked at his face, at the tight lines of his mouth, the way his hands shook as he poured a drink of water. "What happened?" she asked. Silas drank the water, then wiped his mouth. "Nothing, just talk." Ilkay walked to him. She took the cup from his hand and set it down. She placed her hands on his chest, forcing him to look at her. "You are a bad liar." "Silas." He looked at her. The exhaustion washed over him. "They know," he said softly. "They don't have proof, but they know. Rourke called me out. Miller wouldn't give me credit." Ilkay closed her eyes. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of the guilt crushing her. "I'm a poison to you," she whispered. "No," Silas said sharply. "Do not say that. It is true," she said, opening her eyes. Her voice rose, brittle with panic. "Look at your life. Silas, your fields are gone. Your neighbors hate you. They will come for you. They will burn this house." "Let them come," Silas said. "No!" she cried. She pulled away from him, pacing the small room. "I cannot let that happen. I will go. I will take the mule and I will go back to the mountains tonight." Silas grabbed her arm. "You will not! I have to!" she shouted, twisting in his grip. "If I leave, they will stop. You can tell them I stole from you. You can tell them you chased me off. You can have your life back. I don't want that life," Silas shouted back. The words rang in the small cabin, silencing the wind outside. Silas let go of her arm. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "You think I want that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You think I want to go back to sitting in this chair, staring at the wall, drinking until I pass out? You think I want to be safe?" He took a step toward her. "I was dead before you came here. Ilkay, I was walking around. I was breathing. But I was dead. I had nothing. I was just waiting to rot." He ran a hand through his hair, his face twisting with the pain of the confession. "I never thought I deserved anything else," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "After the war, after what I saw, what I did, I thought happiness was for other men, decent men, not for me." He looked at her, tears standing in his eyes. "If you leave," he said, "you don't save me. You kill me. You take the only thing that makes me a man worth being." Ilkay stared at him. She saw the raw, open wound of his soul. She saw the shame he had carried for 5 years, the belief that he was a monster who deserved his isolation. She stepped close to him. She reached up and took his face in her hands. Her fingers were rough, but her touch was gentle, reverent. "Silas," she said softly. She forced him to look at her, to see the fierce light in her black eyes. "You are not that man," she said. "That man is gone. I do not see a soldier. I do not see a killer." She brushed her thumb over his cheekbone. "I see the man who gave me water when I had a knife in my hand," she said. "I see the man who covered my scars. I see the man who bled for my people." She leaned her forehead against his. "I see you," she whispered. "I see what is now, and I love what is now." The word hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. Love. It was a word that belonged to a softer world, a world of parlors and Sunday picnics. Not this hard, dusty reality. Silas let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her into him with a desperation that bordered on violence. "Ilkay," he breathed. He kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the wiki-up. That had been a kiss of survival. This was a kiss of possession, of absolute need. He kissed her as if he could breathe her into his lungs and keep her there forever. She responded with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him down. They stumbled back against the table, the wood groaning under their weight. The air in the cabin grew hot, charged with the friction of their bodies. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. They stripped away the barriers, the heavy wool, the cotton, the guilt, the fear. When his skin touched hers, it felt like coming home. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. They moved to the bed, the narrow mattress that had been his lonely raft for so long. It was not gentle. It could not be gentle. The world outside was trying to kill them. The soldiers were coming. The winter was coming. This moment was stolen from the jaws of disaster. Silas held her, his hands mapping the curve of her spine, the scars on her shoulder. He whispered promises into her skin, promises that they would survive, that they would find a place, that he would never let her go. She clung to him, arching into his touch, her breath hitching in her throat. She anchored him to the earth. She took the shame he carried and burned it away with the heat of her body. In the darkness of the cabin, with the wind howling like a banshee around the eaves, they carved out a sanctuary. For an hour, there was no cavalry, no posse, no hunger. There was only the sweat-slicked reality of two people who had found the one thing worth dying for. The morning brought reality back with the sharp clarity of a bugle call. Silas was outside, checking the perimeter. When he saw the dust cloud on the road toward Dry Creek, it was too big for a wagon. It was a column. Soldiers. He ran back to the cabin. Ilkay was already at the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. "Blue coats," she said, her voice tight. "They are in town," Silas said, grabbing his rifle. "They must have come from Fort Lowell." Holt finally got his wish. The arrival of the military changed the game. A posse was a mob. It could be outsmarted or waited out. The cavalry was a machine. They would have orders. They would have scouts. If they searched the house, Silas began. "They will find the powder," Ilkay finished, "and they will find me." Before they could formulate a plan, a sound from the back of the cabin made them both freeze. It was a soft scratching at the back door, followed by the call of a quail. 3 short bursts. Ilkay's eyes widened. She moved to the door and unbolted it. A boy slipped inside. He was no more than 16, lean as a whip, his chest heaving from running. He wore breeches made of rough canvas and a headband of red cloth. "Choddy," Ilkay breathed. The boy looked at Silas with wild, fearful eyes, then turned to Ilkay. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his hands moving in sharp, agitated gestures. Silas watched, not understanding the words but understanding the tone. The boy was delivering a warning. Ilkay's face fell. She looked at the boy, then back at Silas. She put a hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke quietly, soothing him. "What is it?" Silas asked when the boy fell silent. Ilkay turned to him. She looked tired, older than she had an hour ago. "This is Choddy. He is a runner for Nanstan. He says there is trouble in the band." "What kind of trouble?" "Some of the warriors. The ones who lost family at Verde. They are angry. They say I have betrayed them. They say I am sleeping with the enemy. They say I have been captured by the white man's mind." Silas felt a cold knot in his stomach, even among her own. There was no peace. "They want to leave the Dragoon," Ilkay said. "They want to go south, to Mexico, but they have no horses. They have no food for the journey." Silas looked at the boy, then at the sacks of flour stacked in the corner. "We have food," Silas said. "We have the powder. We cannot get it to them," Ilkay said. "The soldiers are between us and the mountains now. If we try to take the wagon up the main pass, we will be seen." Silas walked to the window. He looked at the landscape, the ridges, the arroyos, the broken country that he knew better than any map. "We don't take the main pass," he said slowly. He turned back to them. "We split up." Ilkay shook her head immediately. "No, I will not leave you." "Listen to me," Silas said, gripping her shoulders. "The soldiers are watching the roads. They are watching for a wagon. They are watching for a white man and an Apache woman together." He pointed to the north. "I will take the wagon and the livestock. I will go north, toward the Slot Canyon at Broken Leg Wash. It is rough country. The cavalry won't patrol there because the horses break their ankles. I can hide the supplies in the caves there." "And me?" Ilkay asked. "You and Choddy go on foot," Silas said. "You stick to the high ridges. You are invisible up there. You meet Nanstan and bring the band to the canyon from the east side. It is dangerous," Ilkay said. If they catch you alone with that much powder." "They won't catch me," Silas said. "I know the wash. I can lose them in the rocks. But to be apart?" She whispered, "It is the only way." Silas said, "We meet at the canyon in 3 days. Then we decide Mexico or somewhere else. But we cannot stay here." He looked around the cabin. He looked at the bed where they had laid together, at the table where they had broken bread. "We are leaving," he said. "For good." The preparation was frantic. They loaded the wagon until the axles groaned. Silas hitched the mule and his own saddle horse. He took his rifle, his Colt, and every scrap of food they hadn't packed. When it was time to go, they stood on the porch. The boy, Chuddy, waited by the tree line, blending into the shadows. Silas took Ilkay's hands. They were trembling. 3 days, he said. Broken leg wash, by the twin pillars. 3 days, she repeated. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small leather pouch on a thong. She placed it around Silas's neck. "It is a stone from the river where I was born," she said. "It brings you back." Silas kissed her. It was a hard, quick kiss, tasting of salt. "Go," he said. She turned and ran toward the trees. She did not look back. She melted into the brush like smoke. Silas watched her go, his heart feeling like a stone in his chest. He climbed onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. He looked at the cabin one last time. He thought about burning it, so Rourke and the others couldn't have it, but that would draw the soldiers. He left it standing. Let the desert take it back, he thought. He snapped the reins. "Hya!" The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding in the dust. Silas Vance drove north, away from the only home he had known for 5 years, driving straight into the heart of the empty, dangerous land, with nothing but a stone around his neck and a hope fragile as glass that he would see the sun rise in 3 days' time. The plan unraveled not with a scream, but with the snap of a dry branch. Silas Vance was 3 miles north of the homestead, guiding the heavily laden wagon through a narrow cut in the limestone known as Devil's Elbow. The sun was high, hammering the rocks with a white, blinding intensity. He was sweating, his shirt sticking to the bandage on his side, his eyes scanning the ridge line. He had taken the route less traveled, the one that broke axles and lamed horses, betting that the cavalry would stick to the hard-pack road. He was wrong. It was not the cavalry. It was Rourke and 4 men from the Holt Ranch. They had not been patrolling the road. They had been watching the homestead from the high ground to the east, waiting like vultures for the carcass to twitch. The first shot took the hat off Silas's head. He didn't have time to reach for the Winchester. 2 riders burst from the mesquite on his left, ropes singing in the air. A loop settled over his shoulders before he could shout. The rope jerked tight, pinning his arms to his sides. Another rope caught his waist. With a brutal heave, he was yanked from the wagon seat. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs in a dusty whoosh. His wound tore open, a fresh bloom of agony that nearly blacked out his vision. Before he could stand, a boot slammed into his jaw. "Stay down, traitor!" Rourke's voice was a jagged rasp. Silas spat blood into the dirt. He tried to roll, to find leverage, but 3 men were on him instantly, kicking and striking with the butts of their rifles. They dragged him to his feet, dazed and bleeding, and tied his hands behind his back with the raw rawhide that cut into his wrists. Rourke walked to the wagon. He slit one of the sacks with his knife. Black powder spilled out, shimmering like dark sand in the sunlight. "Well now," Rourke said, grinning, "that is a lot of stump remover. Vance, or were you planning on starting a war?" Silas said nothing. He tasted copper and dust. He knew this was the end. There would be no jail cell. "Drag him," Rourke ordered. "Let us show the town what a white Apache looks like." They tied him to the saddle horn of Rourke's horse. They did not gallop, but they did not walk slow. Silas was forced to stumble behind, half running to keep from being dragged, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The 4 miles to Dry Creek were a blur of pain and humiliation. In the high country, the air was thinner, sharper. Ilkay and the boy, Chody, had made good time. They were resting in the shadow of a juniper tree. watching the valley floor through a gap in the rocks. Ilkay felt it before she saw it, a sickness in her stomach, a sudden coldness in her hands. She looked down at the ribbon of road leading to the town. She saw the dust cloud. She saw the wagon, driven by a stranger, and the figure stumbling behind the lead horse. "They have him?" she whispered. Chadi looked, squinting against the glare. "The soldiers." "No," Ilkay said. "The ranchers, the hate men." She stood up, her legs trembling. She grabbed her pack. "We must go to the band," Chadi said urgently. "Nanstan waits at the Twin Pillars. We must tell them the supplies are lost." "You go," Ilkay said. "Tell Nanstan the wagon is taken. Tell him to move the people deeper into the mountains." "And you?" Chadi asked, his eyes wide. "I'm going to the town." Chadi grabbed her arm. "You cannot. They will kill you," Nanstan said. "If you go back to the white man, you are dead to us." He said, "You choose your death. I choose my life," Ilkay said, her voice shaking. She looked at the boy. He was young, scared, but alive. Silas had made that possible. Silas had given everything, his land, his blood, his name, so that Chadi could have corn to eat. He is not just a white man. "Chadi," she said, fierce and low. "He is the one who covered me when I was cold. I will not let him die alone among wolves." She turned and ran down the slope, sliding on the loose shale, moving toward the death that waited in the valley. The town of Dry Creek had turned into a single, angry organism. The news had spread faster than a prairie fire. Vance had been caught running powder to the renegades. Rourke rode down the main street, dragging Silas behind him like a trophy. People poured out of the saloon, the mercantile, the church. They lined the boardwalks, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Traitor," a woman screamed. "Savage lover." A rock flew from the crowd, striking Silas in the shoulder. He stumbled but did not fall. He kept his head up, staring straight ahead. He saw the hatred in their eyes, and he did not blame them. In his mind, he was not being punished for the powder. He was being punished for Verde. He was being punished for the women and children he had watched die 5 years ago. This was the bill coming due. Rourke stopped in front of the livery stable. He dismounted and shoved Silas toward a water trough. "Drink," Rourke said mockingly. "Last one you get?" Silas leaned over, drinking the foul, warm water. When he stood up, he saw Jebediah Holt standing on the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his vest. "So," Holt boomed, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "It is true. You were feeding them, arming them, while they steal our cattle and kill our kin." Silas wiped the blood from his mouth. "I was feeding starving people. Holt, and the only killing I have seen lately has been done by you and yours." Holt's face reddened. "String him up," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Not yet," Holt said, raising a hand. "We do this right. We want everyone to see." They dragged Silas to the center of the muddy street. Someone threw a rope over the beam of the hay hoist protruding from the livery loft. Rourke fashioned a noose. The sheriff, a tired man named Brady with a gray mustache, pushed through the crowd. "Now hold on," Brady said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need a judge for this. Holt, you can't just hang a man in the street." He was running powder to hostiles. "Sheriff," Rourke shouted, holding up a handful of the black grains he had taken from the wagon. "That is treason. That is an act of war. Military law says we can shoot a spy on sight. We are being generous giving him a rope." The crowd roared its agreement. Brady looked around, saw the sheer number of angry faces, and stepped back, his hand falling away from his gun. He was a good man, but he was not a brave one. They pushed Silas onto an overturned crate. Rourke dropped the noose over his head and tightened it. The rough hemp scratched Silas's neck, a terrifyingly intimate sensation. Silas looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Miller, the shopkeeper, looking away in shame. He saw the faces of men he had known for years, now strangers. He closed his eyes. "Ilkay," he thought. "Stay in the mountains. Be safe." He waited for the kick that would knock the crate away. "Stop!" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a knife through canvas. It was a woman's voice, clear and steady. The crowd fell silent, heads turning. At the end of the street, where the dust of the road met the boardwalk, stood Ilkay. She was alone. She wore her ragged dress, the one Silas had seen her in that first day. She had no weapon in her hand. She stood tall, her chin lifted, her black hair blowing across her face in the hot wind. A gasp went through the town. A renegade. Here, in the open. "One of them," a man shouted, raising a pistol. "Hold your fire," Holt yelled, sensing the moment shifting. "Let us see what the witch has to say." Ilkay walked forward. She did not run. She walked down the center of the street, passing the men with guns, passing the women clutching their shawls. She walked until she stood 10 feet from the crate where Silas stood with the rope around his neck. She looked up at him. Her eyes were shining, but she did not weep. Silas felt his heart break. "Go," he croaked. "Run." She shook her head. Then she turned to face the crowd. "You call him traitor," she said. Her English was accented, but every word was distinct. "You call him killer." She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. "This man gave me water when I had a knife to cut him. This man covered my scars when I wanted to show him my hate. This man bled to save my people from starvation." She looked at Holt. "You say we are savages," she said. "You say we kill for pleasure, but I see you now. I see you standing here. Hundreds of you, against one man who has no gun. Who is the savage?" The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Shame flickered on a few faces. "He is arming murderers," Rourke shouted, "trying to regain control. He is feeding children," Ilkay screamed back, her composure cracking. "Babies who are coughing blood. Old women who are eating grass. That is who you are fighting." She turned back to Silas. She reached up and touched his bound hands. "He is not one of you," she said softly to the crowd. "He is better than you." Rourke's face twisted in fury. He pulled his pistol. "Enough of this. Shoot the squaw." "No!" Silas roared. He threw his weight sideways, ignoring the rope, ignoring the crate. He slammed into Rourke, knocking him off balance. The crate tipped. Silas's feet slipped. The rope jerked tight, but the knot slipped. It was a hasty knot, tied by a man eager for blood, not careful with his work. Silas crashed to the ground, gasping, the rope burning a line of fire around his throat. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked. A woman screamed. Silas scrambled to his knees, his vision swimming. He saw Rourke leveling his pistol at Ilkay. Silas lunged. He drove his shoulder into Ilkay's waist, tackling her to the ground just as the gun went off. The bullet whined through the space where she had been standing. It did not hit the dirt. Behind them, near the boardwalk, a small boy had stepped out to see the commotion. It was Thomas, the son of the blacksmith, a boy of 8 who had once brought Silas a bucket of water for his mule. Thomas stood still for a second, looking surprised. Then a red blossom appeared on his white shirt. He crumpled to the dust without a sound. The scream that followed tore the throat of the blacksmith's wife. "Thomas!" The crowd froze. The violence that had been boiling over suddenly turned to ice. Every eye turned to the small body lying in the street. Rourke stood with his smoking gun, his face draining of color. I didn't." She moved. In the stunned silence, Silas scrambled up. He pulled Ilkay to her feet. He grabbed a knife from Rourke's belt. The man was too paralyzed to stop him, and slashed the ropes on his wrists. "Get back!" Silas shouted. He shoved Ilkay behind him. He stood over her, the knife in his hand, facing the mob. He was bruised, bleeding. The rope burned purple on his neck, but he looked like a demon rising from the pit. "Kill us!" he screamed at them. "Go ahead. You already killed the boy. Finish it," he panted, his chest heaving. His eyes locked with Holt's. "Is this enough blood for you? Holt, is this what you wanted?" Holt looked at the dead boy, then at Rourke, then at Silas. He stepped back, his arrogance collapsing like a wet sack. Several men raised their rifles, aiming at Silas. Silas did not flinch. He reached back and found Ilkay's hand. He gripped it hard. She squeezed back, her fingers digging into his palm. "I am sorry," he whispered to her, not taking his eyes off the guns. "I am so sorry. Do not be," she whispered back. Her voice was steady, right at his ear. I saw the warmth. "Silas, I had it. If we die, we take it with us. I love you." Silas said, "I know," she answered. They stood there, two outcasts in the dust, united against a town that wanted them dead, bound by a love that had cost them everything. "Lower your weapons," the shout came from the church steps. It was Reverend Caldwell, a thin, severe man who rarely raised his voice. He was running toward the body of the boy. He fell to his knees beside Thomas. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. His hands were covered in the boy's blood. "Shame on you," the Reverend bellowed, his voice breaking. "Shame on all of you. Look what your hate has done." He pointed at Rourke. "You fired the shot, sir." Rourke dropped the gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. Sheriff Brady stepped forward. He looked older, heavier. He walked over to Rourke and kicked the gun away. "That is enough," Brady said quietly. He looked at the crowd. "Go home, all of you. Go home and pray for forgiveness." The mob began to fracture. The energy was gone, sucked out by the tragedy. Men lowered their rifles, looking at their boots. Women turned away, weeping. The blacksmith gathered his son's body in his arms, wailing a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. Brady walked over to Silas and Ilkay. He looked at the knife in Silas's hand. "Put it down." "Vance," Brady said. Silas hesitated. "No one is hanging today." Brady said, "There's been enough dying." Silas slowly lowered the knife. He dropped it. "Get out of here," Brady said. "Take your woman. Go back to your place." Silas looked at the sheriff. He saw a man who was broken by what he had allowed to happen. "Come," Silas said to Ilkay. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, her strength finally failing. They walked through the parting crowd. No one spoke to them. No one spat. They were ghosts walking through a graveyard. They did not go far. They went to the edge of town, to the small cemetery where the graves were dug into the hard caliche. The funeral was held 2 hours later, in the heat of the afternoon. The town buried Thomas. Silas and Ilkay did not leave. They stood at the fence line, watching, when the service was over, and the first shovelful of dirt hit the pine box. Silas opened the gate. He walked to the pile of dirt. He picked up a shovel. The blacksmith looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He looked at Silas, then at Ilkay standing beside him. He saw the rope burn on Silas's neck. He saw the fear and the sorrow in Ilkay's face. He nodded. Just once. Silas began to shovel. Ilkay knelt and began to move the earth with her hands. Slowly, other men picked up shovels. They worked in silence, the rhythm of the metal biting the earth the only sound. Ranchers, shopkeepers, the homesteader, and the Apache woman, they filled the grave together. When it was done, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of red. The blacksmith walked over to Silas. He extended a hand. It was a dirty, calloused hand. Silas took it. "I am sorry for your loss," Silas said. The blacksmith gripped his hand hard, then let go. He looked at Ilkay. He did not smile, but he did not look with hate. He looked with a weary recognition of shared pain. He turned and walked away. The crowd dispersed. Rourke was in a cell, waiting for a circuit judge. Holt had ridden out of town, his head low. Silas and Ilkay stood alone by the fresh grave. "We cannot stay," Silas said. "I know," Ilkay replied, "but we are alive," Silas said. He looked at her. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, her dress torn. She was beautiful. He took the stone from around his neck, the one she had given him, and placed it back in her hand. "You came back," he said. "I told you," she whispered. "I choose life." She closed her fingers over the stone, then took his hand again. "Let us go home, Silas, wherever that is." They walked out of Dry Creek, leaving the town to its grief and its ghosts. They walked west, toward the dying sun. Two small figures against the vast, indifferent landscape, battered and scarred, but walking together. The silence that settled over Dry Creek following the funeral of Thomas the blacksmith's son was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a held breath. The violence had been lanced like a boil, but the wound remained open and weeping. Silas Vance stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the dust settle in the street. Inside, a quiet war was being waged. One fought not with guns, but with the weight of conscience. Sheriff Brady sat behind his desk, looking 10 years older than he had the week before. Across from him sat Jebediah Holt. The rancher was diminished, his hat in his hands, the bluster drained out of him by the sight of a child in a pine box. Reverend Caldwell stood by the window, his back stiff, looking out at the town he had failed to shepherd. "You cannot stay." "Holt," the sheriff said. His voice was flat, devoid of anger, but heavy with finality. Holt looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. "I own 3,000 acres. Brady, my father built that ranch, and your pride dug a grave for an 8-year-old boy," the Reverend said, turning from the window. "The town will not forgive you. Jebediah, every time they look at you, they will see Thomas in the dirt. You stirred the pot until it boiled over." "There is no law that says I have to leave," Holt muttered, though the fight was gone from him. "There is no law," Brady agreed, "but there is no protection for you here either. If you stay, I cannot guarantee your safety. The blacksmith is a patient man, but he is a grieving father. And Rourke is already singing to the circuit judge about who gave the orders to harass the homesteaders." Holt flinched. He looked at his hands. "Sell the herd," Brady said. "Move north, or move east. But go." It was not justice. Silas knew that as he listened from the doorway, there would be no trial for Holt. There would be no restitution for the cornfield that had been trampled or the years of peace that had been stolen. In the territory, justice was often just a matter of who was left standing when the dust cleared. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. Silas walked down the steps. Ilkay was waiting for him by the livery stable, holding the reins of their mule. She wore a new dress, one given to her by the blacksmith's wife in a quiet, tearful act of penance. It was blue cotton, simple and clean, but Ilkay looked uncomfortable in it, as if she were wearing someone else's skin. "He is leaving?" Ilkay asked. "He is leaving," Silas said. She nodded, looking toward the mountains, "And so must we." They rode back to the homestead one last time, not to stay, but to say goodbye. The cabin stood silent and empty, a shell of the life Silas had tried to build. The fields were already reclaiming their wildness, weeds pushing up through the mud where the corn had died. That night, Nanstan and the remnants of the band came down from the high ridges. They did not come to the house. They camped by the creek, lighting a small fire that flickered like a warning star in the darkness. Silas and Ilkay walked out to meet them. The air was cold, smelling of approaching winter. Nanstan sat by the fire, wrapped in a buffalo robe that had seen better days. He looked frail, his eyes clouded with cataracts, but his voice was still iron. "We go south," Nanstan said, "to the mission at San Xavier. The long coats there have promised food. They promise a place where the soldiers will not come. It is a reservation in all but name," a young warrior spat, sharpening a knife. "We will be sheep in a pen. It is better to be a live sheep than a dead wolf." Nanstan wheezed. He looked at Ilkay. He did not look at Silas. "You come, daughter of the Cloud People," Nanstan said. "You know the white man's tongue. You can speak to the priests for us. You are needed." Ilkay stood by the fire, the orange light dancing on her face. She felt the pull of her blood. She felt the duty she owed to the old man who had taught her to track, to the women who had shared her grief. "And him?" Ilkay asked, gesturing to Silas. Nanstan spat into the fire. "He is not of us. He cannot come. The priests will not take a white soldier, and my heart cannot take him." The silence stretched. The wind rattled the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. Ilkay looked at her people. Then she looked at Silas, who stood just outside the ring of firelight, his hands open, waiting. "Then I cannot come," Ilkay said softly. A murmur of anger went through the group. The young warrior stood up. "You choose him over your kin. You choose the enemy. I choose the man who stands beside me, Ilkay said, her voice rising. I choose the man who does not ask me to be only Apache or only white, but lets me be Ilkay. Nanstan shook his head slowly. Then you are lost to us. When we walk south, do not follow. The meeting ended in a fracture that would never heal. The band packed their meager belongings and vanished into the night, heading south toward a life of containment and prayer. Silas and Ilkay returned to the cabin. They lit the oil lamp and sat at the table, their hands clasped over the scarred wood. You could have gone with them, Silas said. You would be safe at the mission? Ilkay looked at him. I do not want safety without you. Silas squeezed her hand. I will go where you go. Ilkay, we can go north, Oregon. I hear there is rain there, green valleys. Ilkay shook her head. No. If we go to the white cities, you will be the man who married a savage. They will look at you with shame. And if we go to the reservation, I will be the woman who sleeps with the enemy. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I dreamed of a place. She said, a place where neither side owns the land. A place where the map is blank. Where is this place? Silas asked. You know it, she said. You told me of it once. The canyon of the echoing water, deep in the Mogollon Rim. Silas frowned. That is hard country. Ilkay, the soil is thin. The winters are brutal. There is no road, but there is water, she said. And there are walls of stone that hide the sky. No rancher will run cattle there. No soldier will march a column there. It is unclaimed. Silas thought of the canyon. He remembered it from his scouting days. A jagged slash in the earth, beautiful and unforgiving. It was a place for mountain lions and hermits. It is a lonely life, Silas warned. Ilkay reached across the table and touched his face. I have been lonely in a crowd of my own people. I have been lonely in your town. I will not be lonely with you. They made their choice, but they did not go alone. The next morning, as they were loading the wagon, 3 figures appeared from the tree line. It was Chodi, the young runner, along with a woman named Dasan and her young daughter. They had slipped away from Nanstan's band in the night. We do not want the mission, Chodi said simply, looking at Silas. We want to live free, even if it is hard. Silas looked at the small group, an outcast soldier, a defiant woman, a boy, and a mother with a child. It was a fragile seed for a community. Load the wagon, Silas said. The journey to the Mogollon Rim took 3 weeks. It was a passage through the anvil of the world. They crossed alkali flats that burned the eyes and climbed ridges where the wind threatened to blow the mules off the trail. They slept under wagons while hail hammered the canvas. They rationed water until their tongues swelled in their mouths. But they moved with a singular purpose. Every mile put between them and Dry Creek was a victory. Every ridge crossed was a barrier against the hate they had left behind. When they finally descended into the canyon of the echoing water, it was late afternoon. The sun was cutting through the high notch in the western wall, bathing the valley floor in a golden light. A spring gushed from the rock face, feeding a ribbon of green willows that defied the surrounding gray stone. It is here, Ilkay whispered. They did not rest. Survival in the rim meant constant labor. Silas and Chodi felled trees, dragging the heavy logs by hand to build a cabin near the spring. It was not a neat structure. It was a hybrid thing. Half log cabin, half Apache wickiup, built low to the ground to cheat the wind. Dasan and Ilkay broke the soil. It was rocky and stubborn, but beneath the grit, there was life. They planted the seed corn Silas had saved. They gathered agave and pine nuts. They hunted deer in the high timber. It was a life stripped of all softness. Their hands were permanently stained with earth and sap. Their clothes were patched until the original fabric was gone. They grew lean and hard. Their muscles roped like old vines. But there was peace. The wind that howled through the canyon did not carry the sound of bugles or the shouts of angry men. It carried only the scent of pine and rain. 6 months after they arrived, the cabin was finished. The corn was knee-high, green flags waving in the breeze. One evening, after the work was done, Silas and Ilkay sat on a bench Silas had hewn from a split log. They sat outside the door, wrapped in a large buffalo robe they had traded for with a passing Ute hunter. The sun was gone, leaving the sky a bruised purple that faded into the black of true night. The stars began to prick through the darkness, sharp and cold. Silas groaned softly as he stretched his legs. My back reminds me I am not 20 anymore. Ilkay laughed. It was a low, rusty sound, but it was real. You were never 20. Silas, you were born old. Silas smiled, reaching for her hand under the robe. Maybe, but I feel younger now than I did 5 years ago. He looked at her profile in the starlight. The sharp angles of her face had softened slightly, not from ease, but from the absence of fear. Ilkay turned to him. Do you miss it? The town? The easy water? The whiskey? Silas shook his head. I missed nothing. The whiskey just helped me forget I was alone. The town just reminded me I didn't fit. He ran his thumb over her knuckles. What about you? He asked. Do you miss the open plains? Sometimes, she admitted. I miss the sound of the drums. I miss the stories of the elders. She paused, looking out at the dark shape of the cornfield. But then I remember the fear. She said, I remember waking up wondering if the blue coats were coming. I remember the hunger. She turned fully toward him, pulling the robe tighter around them both. I told you once that I wanted the love I saw between strangers, she said softly. That gentle thing, that easy thing. Silas nodded. I remember. I was wrong, she said. Silas felt a momentary flicker of panic. Wrong? Yes, she said. That love, that easy love. It is for people who have not bled. It is for people who do not know how fragile the world is. She took his face in her hands, her palms rough and warm. I do not want the easy love. Silas, I want this. I want the love that builds a cabin out of rock. I want the love that stands in front of a mob. I want the love that knows the worst of a man and stays anyway. Silas felt a lump in his throat. He covered her hands with his own. I never thought I would be a man who could build anything, he whispered. I thought my hands were only good for breaking things, for hurting. He kissed her palms. You made me a builder. Ilkay, you made me whole. They stood up and moved inside the cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep red light over the rough walls. The room smelled of cedar smoke and drying herbs. They shed the heavy robe. They moved together with a slowness that defied the harshness of their days. There was no desperation now. There was no frantic need to prove they were alive before death came crashing through the door. Silas unbuttoned her dress, his fingers clumsy but patient. Ilkay unbuckled his belt, her touch lingering on the old scar of the bullet wound in his side. When they lay down on the mattress stuffed with river grass, it was a meeting of equals. They held each other with a reverence that was almost holy. They explored the map of each other's bodies, the scars, the calluses, the lines of age and worry, and found them beautiful. He kissed her neck, her shoulder, the place over her heart. She tangled her fingers in his graying hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. We are here, she whispered in the dark. We are here, he answered. And in the quiet of the canyon, sheltered from the wind and the world, they loved each other with a steady, enduring flame that burned brighter than any fire. Epilogue. 5 years later, 1883, the canyon of the echoing water had changed. There were 3 cabins now. The cornfield had expanded, terraced up the side of the creek bank. There were goats grazing on the hillside, watched over by a dog with one ear, a trader, a man named Henderson who dared the mountain passes to trade with the isolated settlements, rode his mule up the trail. He was looking for furs, for turquoise, for anything of value. He stopped his mule at the edge of the clearing. He saw a man working in the field, a white man, broad-shouldered and bearded, swinging a hoe with a rhythmic grace. He saw an Apache woman by the creek, washing clothes, and he saw a child. A boy, perhaps 4 years old, was running through the rows of corn. He had black hair that caught the sun and skin the color of polished tea. He was shouting, mixing English words with Apache laughter. Henderson watched, his face twisting in a mix of curiosity and distaste. a half-breed, a mongrel child in a mongrel camp. The white man stopped hoeing. He looked up, sensing the intruder. He walked to the edge of the field, resting the hoe on his shoulder. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply watched, his eyes hard and protective. The Apache woman stood up. She walked to the man's side. She did not hide behind him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him, her hand resting on his arm. The boy ran to them, grabbing the man's leg. The man reached down and ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture of infinite tenderness that seemed at odds with the gun on his hip. Henderson felt a strange unease. He had seen mixed couples before, usually hiding in the shadows of the mining camps, bowing their heads in shame. These two did not bow. They looked at him with a quiet, terrifying defiance. They looked like kings of a kingdom he could not understand. "Just passing through," Henderson muttered, tipping his hat nervously. "Pass on, then," the white man said. His voice was calm, but it held the weight of a rock slide. Henderson kicked his mule and rode on, eager to be away from the intensity of their gaze. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rim, Silas and Ilkay sat in their doorway. The boy, who they had named Thomas after the one who fell, was asleep inside, exhausted from his day of chasing lizards. Silas whittled a piece of pine. Ilkay mended a shirt. "That traitor," Silas said. He had the look. "Let him look," Ilkay said, biting a thread. "He looks at us and sees a mistake. I look at us and see a miracle." She put the shirt down and leaned into him. She rested her head on his shoulder, the familiar, solid weight of him. She listened to his breathing. She looked out at the small valley, at the green corn, at the walls of stone that held them safe. She remembered the mission. The girl, hiding in the bushes, watching a stranger's tenderness with an ache in her chest that felt like dying. "Silas," she said softly. I saw it once," she whispered, closing her eyes. "From far away." She took his hand and placed it over her heart, covering the old scars, covering the memories of fire and blood. "But now," she said, her voice thick with contentment, "now I have it, and it is better than I saw." Silas kissed the top of her head. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her against the cooling night. "It is ours," he said. The wind blew down the canyon, shaking the willows, but the lamp in the window burned steady and true, a beacon in the vast, wild dark. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Silas and Ilkay resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below sharing your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of grit, survival, and the human heart. Share your thoughts on the ending in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.